It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when Miss Evelyn Walker decided to visit a new cafe in the downtown area. The sun was shining, and a gentle breeze moved through the streets, carrying the scent of fresh flowers from nearby gardens. Ms. Walker, dressed in a soft floral dress, walked slowly but with grace. Her silver hair was neatly pinned up, and a small brown purse hung from her arm. The cafe was lively. Young people filled the tables, chatting, laughing, and tapping away on their laptops. Bright paintings covered the walls and soft music played in the background. Ms. Walker stepped inside, smiling politely at a group near the door, but they barely noticed her. She didn't mind. She had seen such things before. Taking small steps, she made her way to a cozy corner table near the window. She liked to sit where she could watch the world outside. The seat was comfortable, and the sunlight warmed the little spot just enough to make it feel welcoming. As she settled in, a young waiter named Brad noticed her. He was busy carrying plates and chatting with a group of young customers at a nearby table. When he saw Ms. Walker, his smile faded a little. He sighed quietly but walked over to her table, holding a menu. His steps were slower, and his face didn't show the same friendliness he had given the others. Ms. Walker looked up at him with a gentle smile. "Good afternoon," she said in a soft voice. Brad didn't answer. He simply placed the menu on the table and walked away without a word. Ms. Walker watched him go but didn't say anything. She had lived many years and had learned patience. Still, a small ache formed in her heart. Around her, waiters rushed to serve other customers, bringing them drinks and plates filled with delicious food. Ms. Walker waited quietly, her hands folded neatly on the table. Minutes passed, but no one came to take her order. She watched as new customers entered, were greeted with bright smiles, and seated quickly. She remained invisible. She glanced at her watch and decided to give it a little more time. She didn't want to cause trouble. She believed that kindness could often solve more than anger ever could. Maybe they were just busy, she thought to herself. But deep down she knew she had experienced this kind of treatment before, many times in her life. Even now, after all she had done, there were still places where respect had to be earned again and again. Outside the window, the breeze stirred the leaves in the trees. Ms. Walker smiled softly to herself, remembering the words her mother once told her. Your worth is not decided by how others see you, but by how you walk through the world. As she waited, unaware of the storm about to unfold, Ms. Walker remained calm, her spirit steady like a deep river that had weathered many storms before. Minutes passed, and Ms. Walker still sat quietly at her table. She kept her hands folded neatly, her eyes calm as she watched the waiters move quickly from one table to another. Plates of food and tall glasses of colorful drinks floated past her, but none stopped at her table. Brad, the young waiter who had given her the menu without a greeting, glanced over at her now and then. Each time he did, he frowned slightly, as if hoping she would simply leave. Finally, Ms. Walker raised her hand gently to get his attention. It was a small, polite gesture, the kind anyone would make. Brad sighed loudly enough for a few people nearby to hear. He walked over to Ms. Walker's table, but his steps were slow, and his face was tight with annoyance. "What do you need?" he asked in a flat voice, not even trying to hide his impatience. Ms. Walker looked up at him with the same calm smile she had worn when she entered. "I would like a glass of water, please," she said softly. Brad crossed his arms and glanced around the cafe as if searching for an excuse. The cafe was busy, but it was clear that other tables were being served without any trouble. "We're a bit busy," he said sharply. "Maybe you should try somewhere else." The words hung in the air like a heavy stone. A few nearby customers looked over briefly but then turned away, pretending they hadn't heard. Ms. Walker's face remained peaceful, though her heart ached slightly. She gave a small nod and lowered her hand. Without waiting for a reply, Brad turned and walked away. He didn't bring the water. He didn't even look back. Ms. Walker sat quietly, her mind full of thoughts she had lived through many times before. She had worked her whole life to build bridges, to open doors for others, yet here she was, still being treated as if she didn't belong. But Ms. Walker knew better than to respond with anger. She had learned long ago that true strength showed itself in patience, not shouting. She adjusted her purse on her lap and gazed out the window again. The trees swayed in the soft wind, and a few birds hopped along the sidewalk, searching for crumbs. Inside the cafe, laughter and conversation filled the air. It was as if she didn't even exist. But Ms. Walker was used to being overlooked, and she was stronger for it. Somewhere deep in her heart, she knew that life had a way of teaching lessons at just the right time. And though she didn't know it yet, a lesson was about to come for everyone in that cafe, one they would not soon forget. For now, she simply sat still, a quiet and powerful presence, waiting for what would come next. Just as Ms. Walker was thinking about whether she should quietly leave, the cafe door swung open. A young man in a sharp gray suit stepped inside. He had a strong and confident walk, and his eyes moved quickly across the room, searching for someone. Many heads turned to look at him. There was something about him that made people notice. He wasn't loud or showy, but there was a calm power in the way he carried himself. When his eyes landed on Ms. Walker, sitting alone at her corner table, his whole face lit up with a warm and familiar smile. He walked straight toward her, weaving through the busy tables. Ms. Walker looked up and smiled back, her face softening with recognition. The young man reached her table and leaned down to hug her warmly, careful not to knock over anything on the small table. The customers nearby watched with quiet curiosity. They didn't know who Ms. Walker was, but they could tell she was important to the young man. After the hug, the young man straightened up and turned toward the counter where Brad was standing. With a polite but firm voice, he called out, "Excuse me, could we please get some service here?" Brad, who had been chatting with a group of young customers, looked up with a frown. When he saw it was Ms. Walker's table again, his face tightened. He walked over slowly, clearly not happy about being called. "What do you want?" Brad asked, his voice sharp and disrespectful. The young man, still standing beside Ms. Walker, kept his cool. He looked at Brad carefully, his eyes steady and calm. "Do you have any idea who you just refused to serve?" he asked, his voice low but clear enough for nearby customers to hear. The cafe grew quieter. People turned in their seats, sensing that something serious was about to happen. Even the music seemed to fade into the background. Brad shifted uncomfortably, but didn't answer. He gave a little shrug as if to say he didn't care. The young man took a slow breath. He placed his hand gently on Ms. Walker's shoulder, a small gesture of respect. "This woman," he said, "is someone who has done more for this country than most people in this room will ever know." Customers leaned in closer, their curiosity growing. Phones started slipping out of pockets, ready to search for answers. Brad stared, confused and unsure of what to say. He had clearly misjudged Ms. Walker, thinking she was just another old woman taking up space in a busy cafe. Now, standing in front of him was a man who spoke with such certainty that even the most distracted customers stopped to listen. The air in the cafe changed. There was a tension now, a feeling that something important was unfolding right before everyone's eyes. And Ms. Walker, as calm as ever, simply waited, knowing that sometimes truth needed no anger to be heard. The young man pulled out a chair and sat down next to Ms. Walker. He placed his hand lightly on the table and looked around the cafe. The room was nearly silent now, with customers pretending not to stare but stealing glances whenever they could. Brad stood awkwardly by the table. He seemed unsure whether to stay or leave. He shifted from one foot to the other, his earlier confidence fading away. Still, he said nothing. "My name is Marcus," the young man said loudly enough for people nearby to hear. "And this amazing woman is my mother." A small wave of whispers moved through the cafe. Ms. Walker gave a soft chuckle, amused by the attention but staying quiet. She had always believed that actions spoke louder than words. Marcus turned his gaze back to Brad. "She is not just my mother," he continued. "She is a hero. She has spent her whole life fighting for justice, for people she didn't even know. While others stayed silent, she spoke up. While others turned away, she stood strong." Brad looked uncomfortable, but still, he said nothing. He was trapped now between his pride and the truth that was slowly unfolding in front of everyone. "You see," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm, "when you refused to serve her, you were not just being rude. You showed disrespect to someone who helped build the rights you enjoy today. Every time you vote, Every time you walk freely into a place like this, people like her made it possible. A woman at a nearby table pulled out her phone and started typing quickly. Another man whispered something to his friend, both of them looking wide-eyed at Ms. Walker. Even the other staff behind the counter were frozen, their hands still, their faces tense. The manager peeked out from the kitchen, sensing trouble but unsure how to handle it. Ms. Walker, through it all, sat with the same peaceful look on her face. She didn't need to defend herself. She didn't need to prove anything. Her life had already spoken louder than any argument could. Brad finally cleared his throat. "I didn't know," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Marcus nodded slowly. "You didn't care to know," he replied. "And that's the real problem." The truth of Marcus's words hit the room hard. People lowered their eyes, feeling the weight of the moment. It was no longer just about one rude waiter and one forgotten customer. It was about the many times people had looked away, had judged without understanding, had chosen silence instead of kindness. The cafe, once full of laughter and noise, now felt heavy with a new understanding. And Ms. Walker, sitting tall and proud, remained a quiet light in the middle of it all, a reminder that real strength comes from patience, dignity, and the courage to stand quietly even when the world turns its back. Marcus stayed seated next to Ms. Walker, his hands resting calmly on the table. The room remained still. It seemed like even the clinking of glasses and the buzzing of phones had disappeared. Every person in the cafe was now paying quiet attention, waiting to see what would happen next. Brad stood frozen in place. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. He looked around helplessly, but no one rushed to his side. It was clear now that he would have to face this moment on his own. Ms. Walker looked up at him kindly, her eyes full of a quiet wisdom. She wasn't angry. She wasn't shouting. She simply waited, giving Brad the space to do the right thing if he chose to. After a long pause, Marcus spoke again, his voice steady and even. "It's easy to treat people well when you think they are important, but true character is shown when you treat everyone with respect, no matter who they are." A few customers nodded quietly, feeling the truth in his words. Some lowered their heads, ashamed at how they had ignored Ms. Walker when she first walked in. They had seen her treated poorly and had said nothing. Brad shifted again, his face red with shame. He glanced at the manager, who was still peeking out from behind the kitchen door but offered no help. It was clear that the responsibility was his alone. Marcus leaned back slightly, giving Brad a chance to speak. But Brad stayed silent, trapped between pride and guilt. Ms. Walker finally broke the silence. Her voice was soft but full of strength. "Everyone makes mistakes," she said gently. "What matters is what you do after." The words hung in the air, light but powerful. She was offering him a way forward, a chance to learn instead of being crushed by shame. A young woman seated at a nearby table wiped her eyes quietly. A man in a business suit put his phone down and simply watched, his face thoughtful. Brad swallowed hard and nodded slightly. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough and low. "I didn't mean to be disrespectful." Ms. Walker smiled kindly. "Then make sure you don't treat anyone else that way," she said. "Not just the people you recognize, but everyone." The room seemed to breathe again, the tension slowly melting away. People looked at Ms. Walker with new eyes, seeing her not just as an elderly woman, but as a symbol of grace and quiet strength. Marcus stood up, ready to leave with his mother, as he helped her to her feet. The cafe remained silent, watching them as they moved toward the door. There were no angry words, no harsh scenes, just a simple but powerful moment that would stay with everyone who witnessed it. And as they stepped out into the sunlight, Ms. Walker's spirit shone brighter than anything in that busy little cafe. As Ms. Walker and Marcus stepped outside, the bright afternoon sun wrapped around them like a warm blanket. The street was busy with people, cars rolled by slowly, and the sweet smell of fresh bread from a nearby bakery floated through the air. Marcus walked beside his mother, matching her steady pace. He carried a quiet pride in his heart, not because of the scene that had just happened, but because of the way Ms. Walker had handled it, with grace, strength, and kindness. Inside the cafe, the air felt different. Customers stayed quiet, thinking deeply. Brad stood near the counter, staring at the door where Ms. Walker had just left, His mind raced with thoughts. He knew he had judged someone without understanding who she really was. But even more than that, he realized he had treated her unfairly just because she seemed different from the others. The manager finally stepped out from the kitchen, his face tight with worry. He looked around at the still and silent cafe. It was clear to him that the reputation of their place had just changed, and not for the better. A young woman seated by the window spoke up quietly. Who was she? She asked, looking at her friend. The friend, who had been typing on her phone earlier, looked up with wide eyes. Her name is Evelyn Walker, she said softly. She's a civil rights leader. She fought for equal rights when it was dangerous to do so. She's been honored by presidents. There are books about her. A ripple of shock moved through the cafe. People who had ignored Ms. Walker moments ago now realized they had been sitting in the presence of history and had failed to see it. An older man at the back of the cafe shook his head slowly. We were too busy to notice, he said, almost to himself, too busy to show a little respect. Meanwhile, outside, Marcus and Ms. Walker strolled slowly down the sidewalk. Cars honked in the distance, children laughed as they played nearby, and a dog barked at a bird fluttering overhead. Life continued, simple and steady. Ms. Walker looked over at Marcus and smiled warmly. You didn't have to say anything back there, she said. Marcus shrugged lightly. Maybe not, he said. But sometimes people need to be reminded. Ms. Walker nodded thoughtfully. True change, she said, doesn't always happen through big speeches. Sometimes it happens when one person decides to treat another with kindness and respect. Marcus smiled at his mother, feeling a deep sense of admiration. He knew the world was better because of people like her, people who chose dignity over anger, patience over pride. They walked on together, 2 generations side by side, knowing that small actions could carry great power, and that the strength of a quiet heart could echo louder than the noisiest crowd. And somewhere behind them, in a little cafe that once bustled with noise, the seeds of a lesson were taking root, promising to grow into something better. Back inside the cafe, the quiet hung in the air like a heavy blanket. Customers who had been laughing and chatting earlier now sat with thoughtful faces. Some stared at their coffee cups, others whispered quietly to the people sitting with them. Brad slowly walked back behind the counter. He felt a tight knot in his chest. Every step he took seemed heavier than the last. He glanced at the door again, wishing he could turn back time and fix what he had done. The manager came over to him with a deep frown. We can't run a place like this, he said in a low voice. People talk. People remember. Brad nodded without looking up. He already knew. He had seen the way people in the cafe had reacted. They hadn't just been upset with him. They had been disappointed. There was a difference, and somehow that difference hurt even more. One of the waitresses, a kind young woman named Sarah, approached Brad carefully. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she set a clean glass of water on the counter in front of him. Maybe next time, she said gently, you offer the water before you offer your judgment. Then she walked away, leaving Brad to think about her words. Across the cafe, 2 teenage boys who had been scrolling through their phones earlier were now reading quietly about Ms. Walker. They found pictures of her standing in front of huge crowds, leading peaceful marches, speaking powerful words. They found stories about how she had stood up to unfair rules, even when it meant risking her safety. We had no idea, one of the boys whispered. Yeah, said the other, she's like a real hero. They looked toward the empty table where Ms. Walker had sat. It was strange how a quiet figure could leave such a big space behind. Meanwhile, outside, Marcus and Ms. Walker continued their walk. They passed by small shops and friendly faces, some people nodding politely as they walked by. No one outside the cafe knew what had just happened, and Ms. Walker preferred it that way. She didn't need a crowd. She had spent her whole life doing the right thing without needing applause. Marcus pulled out his phone to check the time. A small message popped up on his screen. It was from a news site he followed. Already, someone had shared what happened at the cafe. The headline read, Local hero disrespected in cafe. Teaches lesson without saying a harsh word. He showed it to his mother. Ms. Walker chuckled softly but said nothing. You've always believed in quiet strength, Marcus said with a smile. It's the strongest kind, she replied. And so they walked on, 2 steady figures moving through a noisy world, carrying with them a lesson many had just begun to learn, that real respect has no price, no title, and no costume. It is something you offer freely, simply because it is right. As Ms. Walker and Marcus walked farther down the street, the world around them felt calm and full of promise. They passed a group of children drawing with colorful chalk on the sidewalk. Bright suns, flowers, and smiling faces covered the ground. Ms. Walker smiled at the sight, feeling hope for the future. Marcus stopped near a bench and motioned for his mother to sit. She agreed with a nod, and they both sat quietly, watching the busy street. People hurried by, each lost in their own thoughts, but the two of them sat still, sharing a peaceful moment. Inside the cafe, change had already begun. Sarah, the kind waitress, went around refilling customers' coffees with a smile. She spoke warmly to each person, as if reminding them how simple kindness could be. The young boys who had read about Ms. Walker decided to share her story online, hoping others would learn from it too. Brad stood at the counter, wiping it down slowly. His mind was full of thoughts. He knew he could not erase what had happened, but maybe he could start changing how he treated people. Maybe the next time someone walked through the door, he would see them for who they really were, a person deserving respect. Meanwhile, a soft buzz filled the cafe as more people read about Ms. Walker on their phones. Her story was spreading fast, not because she had shouted or demanded attention, but because she had stayed strong and calm when it mattered most. Back at the bench, Marcus turned to his mother. "Do you ever get tired of teaching lessons?" he asked, half joking. Ms. Walker chuckled. "Teaching is not about shouting or forcing people to listen," she said. "It's about planting a seed and trusting it will grow, even if you never see it bloom." Marcus thought about her words and smiled. It was true. She had planted seeds wherever she went, seeds of kindness, respect, and courage. A small bird landed nearby, pecking at crumbs on the ground. Ms. Walker watched it quietly, her heart full of peace. She had seen hard times, she had fought difficult battles, but she had never let bitterness take root in her heart. People passing by the bench sometimes glanced at Ms. Walker without knowing who she was. They didn't know they were looking at someone who had helped shape history. But Ms. Walker didn't need their recognition. She carried her strength inside her, steady and bright. Marcus stood up and offered his hand to help his mother. Together, they continued their walk, leaving behind the bench, the busy street, and the lessons that would ripple out long after they were gone. And some were back at the cafe, and now across the internet, people were starting to remember a simple but powerful truth, that every person deserves respect, and that sometimes the quietest voices are the ones that change the world.